Today's tale comes from the eastern fens of the marchlands, where progress met mud, certainty met water, and a single cry was torn loose and carried forward without anyone quite knowing why.
The first thing they did was walk the line at first light, with iron pegs and a length of cord. A man in a clean coat looked at the water. He stood on a hump of firmer peat and pointed with the butt of his staff. "There," he said, "from that tree to the bend, then straight across." Risa watched from a little way off, while her brother Pell crouched beside her. The reeds around them stirred, and a heron lifted. "They'll lose a boot," Pell said. "They'll do worse than that," Risa replied. Behind them, Keb emerged from the reed shadows, his back bent from years of cutting and hauling. He leaned on his spade. "You two, go fetch your mother. Tell her it's begun proper." "It began when they showed up yesterday," Pell said. Keb spat into the mud. "Yesterday was talk. Today is the first peg." Risa glanced again at the man in the clean coat. Beside him stood a broader figure with a shaved head and a scar on his cheek. That one did not carry pegs. He carried a sword, and his men carried hooks and axes. "That's him," Pell said. Risa did not have to ask who. She had heard the name in the last week more times than she liked, spoken like a curse and a warning. Juff the Wild. He was not a lord or a sheriff. He was a man who had gathered other men by promising them land that was not his, and a fortune that required someone else to starve. He had come down from the east with wagons that had bogged on the first narrow causeway, and with plans to drain the fens and build a straight road. He would lay stone where reed and water had been since anyone could remember, and still talk of progress. Risa turned away. "Come on." They slipped back through the reeds, along a path only the fenfolk could see, where the water was shallow enough for footing, and the peat held firm if you stepped in the right hollows. Their mother was at the fish racks behind the house, turning the last of yesterday's catch so it would not spoil. The racks were set higher, near the stilted timbers of their home. Everything there was built with the assumption that water would rise and the ground would move, and all that you did not lash down could be taken. Sarah looked up as they approached, and Risa knew she had already heard. "They're pegging," Risa said. Sarah frowned. "Where?" "Near the alder bend." Sarah wiped her hands on her skirt and reached for her shawl. "Tell your aunt, tell Sen, tell anyone with a boat that still floats." Pell hesitated. "We gonna talk or fight?" Sarah's eyes went to him, and for a moment he looked young again. "We talk until talk is gone," she said. "Then we do what we must to keep the water in its place." "The water is in its place," Pell said stubbornly. "That's the point," Sarah replied, and the way she said it told Risa that she was afraid. Word travelled fast in the fens, and by the time Risa and Pell returned with their mother, there were already a dozen locals gathered at the edge of the pegged line. They came with whatever they had to hand: spades, cutting hooks, long poles. 2 men brought a net. Aunt Imoni stood with her arms crossed, and Sen was there too. Juff's men had driven 6 pegs already, the cord drawn taut between them. The clean-coated man stood, looking over a slate and writing. Sarah stepped forward first. "Who gave you leave?" Juff turned his head and smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. "I've bought it," he said. "You can't buy water," Aunt Imoni said. Juff glared at her. "You can buy the rights to drain it, old woman. Amounts to the same." Sen's voice came in. "From whom?" Juff shrugged. "From those who matter." "That's a clever way of saying you paid someone who never once stood in this mud," Sarah said. The clean-coated man fidgeted. He preferred ink and coin over confrontation, but Juff did not. "You live like rats in a bog," he said. "That's the truth of it. I can make this land feed people. I can build and bring trade. You can be paid for leaving, and you can stop pretending this is yours." A ripple of incredulity spread through the gathered fenfolk, and Sarah held up a hand. "We don't want your coin, we want you gone." Juff's smile widened. "Then you'll have to move us." He nodded. Two of his men stepped forward with axes and began cutting reeds along the line, clearing a channel. Sen stepped into the mud and planted his pole. "Stop that." One of the axemen laughed. "Make me, bog rat." And that was the moment the talking was done. Riza saw it in Sarah's eyes. She did not shout or plead. She walked forward and grabbed the cord between the pegs with both hands. "This line is a lie," Sarah said, and yanked. The cord snapped. It was only twine, and it whipped back and slapped against Axeman's wrist. The pegs nearest the break wobbled, and one fell into the mud with a soft gulp. Almost immediately, one of the men lunged and struck Sarah across the face with the back of his hand. Sarah staggered, and Riza moved without thinking. She pushed forward, her hook raised, and would have put it into the man's shoulder if Pell had not caught her arm. Riza, not yet. Sarah straightened up, a red mark already blooming on her cheek. She touched it and looked at the blood on her fingertips. Juff watched her. "There," he said. "That's the truth. You're not people who can bargain. You're people who can be moved." Keb came up behind Riza, close enough that she could smell the peat on him. "You see it?" "See what?" He nodded toward Juff. "He's not here for land yet. He's here for the first win. He wants you to bow. If you bow, the pegs go in properly tomorrow, and the day after, and your children will grow up on dry stone." Riza swallowed. "What do we do?" Keb's eyes were on the water. "We make the ground speak." Juff gave new orders. "Drive the pegs again, cut the reeds, start the channel." His men moved, but Sarah moved too, only this time she did not go to the cord. She bent and scooped a handful of mud and flung it hard into the face of the scar-jawed man who hit her. It was such a small, ignoble act that it shocked everyone. The man shouted, blinded and wiping at his eyes. Mud ran down his cheeks, and now Juff's smile vanished. "Enough," he said, and drew his sword. The blade was clean and too fine for that place. Riza felt the line being crossed. Once a sword came out, it did not go back in without blood. Pell let go of her arm. "Stay behind me," he said. Juff took one step forward and the ground took 2 steps away. It was not magic or a miracle. It was the simple fact that the peat was layered and deceptive. Keb had chosen this place for a reason. He had cut reeds and cleared silt in the last few days without anyone noticing, and opened a thin seam of water just beneath the surface, a place that would look solid until weight pressed down on it. Juff's boot sank with a wet, sucking sound, and he halted. His men laughed nervously, and Juff pulled his foot up, though it took enormous effort. "You think you're clever," he said. Keb came forward at last, his spade in his hands. "No, we think you're not so smart." Juff's gaze moved to him. "Who are you?" A man who knows what takes root and what drowns, Keb said. You want to build. I say, build somewhere else. Juff flexed. I don't take direction from peasants. He raised his sword and pointed it at Keb. The gesture was theatrical and it made the locals hiss. Put that away, Sarah said. Her voice was steady now, though the red mark on her cheek had darkened. Juff did not put it away. He stepped around the weak patch, carefully this time, and came on. His men followed, spreading slightly, trying to flank the locals on firmer ground. Keb lifted his spade and drove its edge into the peat with a hard chop. Water welled instantly, and the surface around the pegs trembled. Riser understood then that this was not about meeting steel with steel. It was about making the fens do what they did best, which was to wreck confidence. Sen and Aunt Ameni moved too. They jammed their poles into the mud at angles, levering up chunks of peat and dragging them aside. The ground began to break into islands. Juff's men staggered and stumbled. One cursed as his boot vanished up to the ankle. Another went down to his knee, pitching forward. Hold the line, Juff snapped, his voice strained now. Pell, Riser, and the others moved like people who belonged there, while Juff's men moved like people who believed the land would obey just because they wished it. The first real blow came when the scar-jawed man, recovered from the mud, swung his axe at Sarah. She ducked, and the blade bit into a pole instead. Pell stepped in and jammed his hook into the man's wrist. Not deep enough to take the hand, but deep enough to make him drop the axe with a yelp. The man's face twisted, and he drove his shoulder into Pell, knocking him off balance. Pell's boots slid in the mud, and he went down hard. Riser screamed his name and lunged. Her hook caught the man's arm, and he snarled at her as he raised his other hand. For a second she saw what he meant to do, and his punch was headed toward her, until Keb's spade struck him across the ribs. Juff slashed at Sen's pole and cut clean through it. Sen jerked back in shock as Juff advanced. No, Sarah said, and stepped between them. Juff struck at her, and she caught the blade on the haft of her own hook. The impact jolted her arms as the blade scraped along the wood. Riser did not know how to fight with a sword. She knew how to pull a net, cut reeds, and keep herself alive in water that could kill, though. She ran past and drove her hook into the cord, still tied to one of the pegs, then yanked hard, freeing the peg. The sudden release made the nearest patch of peat slump, and Juff's foot slid as he lost his balance. Keb saw it too. He did not swing at Juff. He swung at the ground. His spade cut and pried, and the surface under Juff's next step gave way, dropping him to mid-shin. He swore, furious now, and hacked at the reeds around him. Get them, he barked at his men. Break their hands. Make them leave. The men surged. The locals were fewer, older and less armoured, but they had the fens and the desperation of people defending their homes. The fighting spread along the reed edge, and a punt was shoved into the water and used as a barrier. A net was thrown to entangle legs, and a pole cracked and snapped. The air was filled with wet breath and curses, and the sound of mud flying and reeds being crushed. Riser found herself beside Aunt Emily, both of them watching for the next rush. You all right? Emily asked. Riser nodded, though her hands shook. Pell's down. Emily saw that Pell was on his knees now, one hand pressed to his side, where he had been kicked, and was trying to get up. We can't hold for long, she said. Riser's mouth felt dry. Then what do we do? Emily's lips pulled back. We make a mess so big, It can't be cleaned without drowning. That sounded like madness, but it was also the only plan the fens had ever offered. The encroachers tried to push past the reed edge toward the higher ground where the houses stood. Juff shouted, directing them away from the worst patches. He was not stupid, and he adapted quickly, herding his men along the firmer causeways and the narrow ridges of peat the locals used, trying to take advantage of the improved footing. "Cut their boats," Juff called. "Burn the racks. Make them run." The clean-coated man, forgotten in the rush, watched all of this and just clutched his slate to his chest. Riser saw Sarah near the front. She was not a fighter either, but there are kinds of anger that gird a woman. Keb moved like a shadow, always at the edge, always cutting into ground instead of flesh. Each time his spade went in, water rose. The peat slumped, the reed beds shifted, and the paths Juff tried to use became treacherous. But still they pressed forward. They had the numbers, they had steel, and they had the incentive of men promised reward. A shout went up. Someone had slipped into deeper water. Riser turned and saw young Ket, barely more than a boy, flailing as the mud took him. Two of Juff's men laughed as Pell lurched toward him. "No," Riser said, but Pell did not hear. He plunged, grabbing at Ket's arm, hauling him up with a grunt. The rescuing slowed him, and Juff's scar-jawed man saw it and ran in, axe raised. Keb was close by, and he shouted something, not words Riser understood, but a sharp call like one used to warn of moving ground. The locals heard and stepped back, but Juff's man did not. He stepped onto a patch that looked solid, and it folded like soaked bread. His legs sank, and the axe dipped. He swore, trying to free himself, while Pell, panting and half-dragging Ket, saw the opening. He raised his hook to strike, and the scar-jawed man lifted his eyes and spat mud. "Do it," he growled. Pell hesitated, and Riser saw it. Juff roared and shoved forward, sword raised, coming to protect his man. Pell's hook trembled, and Juff's blade flashed. Sarah shouted something, which was lost in the noise, while Riser tried to scream and could not. And then Keb moved between them. He stepped into the soft ground, without care for his own footing, and planted his spade like a banner. Juff's sword came down toward him. Keb did not lift the spade to block. He lifted his voice and hollered, "Rend Hull!" It did not sound like a spell. It sounded like a work call, like the barked phrase men used when hauling a punt free of suction or forcing something stubborn to give. Riser had heard it all her life. It was muttered, spat, half-sung, and always accompanied hard labour. Pull hard, tear loose, break the hold, rend hull. Keb shouted it with a force that made it sound new. The two words cracked out over the water and seemed to strike the air. For an instant, everyone heard it. Even Juff, mid-swing, seemed to register the sound. Keb drove the spade down into the peat between them, and black water surged up, pouring into the space where Juff's boot had been searching for grip. The suction that had been holding the scar-jawed man now dragged him down to his thigh. He screamed in sudden terror at being taken by something that did not acknowledge his strength. Juff's sword strike went wild, and his balance floundered as the earth moved beneath him. His blade sliced the air, but he sank further. "This place doesn't take orders," Keb yelled, voice rough. Juff bared his teeth. He tried to lunge again, but the ground grabbed at him greedily. He hauled his leg free with some effort, while his men surged to pull the scar-jawed man out, and in doing so, they bunched together. Keb shouted again. Not the words this time, but a more urgent cry, and the locals moved. They slammed poles into peat and pried and opened seams. The patch under the bunched men gave and sagged. One went down to his waist, shrieking. Another fell forward, and his face hit water. Panic flared as they all realized that steel meant nothing when you could not stand. The fight then turned into disorder. Juff's men began to retreat, and the clean-coated man dropped his slate and saw it vanish into the mud. Juff shouted at them to hold and regroup. He was learning what fen folk learned young, that you can be brave and still be swallowed. Sarah moved forward, her hook raised. "Get out," she said. "Out. Now." Juff's eyes snapped to her. His face was streaked with mud now, and his fine coat was ruined. He was standing in a place that did not respect him. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is today," Sarah replied. Juff glowered at the gathered fenfolk, counting and remembering. He settled on Keb, still planted like a root in shifting ground. "You, what did you say?" "Words that belong here, to us," replied Keb. Juff took one step forward, then another, testing the ground like a man on thin ice. He lifted his sword slightly, but his men grabbed at him, urging retreat, and for a moment he resisted, caught between rage and survival. But then the fens chose for him. The part Keb had opened shifted again, and the ground under Juff's left boot softened and dropped. He went down to the knee with a wet jerk. The loss of dignity was humiliating. He swore as his men hauled him back. They retreated in a disjointed line, dragging the scar-jawed man, who was sobbing now, with mud up to his chest and a face pale with shock. The fenfolk did not cheer. They watched, breathing hard, hands tight on their tools. When the last of Juff's men reached firmer ground beyond the reed edge, Juff turned and looked back across the broken peat. "You can't live like this forever. You'll drown in your own filth." "We've been here longer than your plans," Aunt Imoni called back. Juff growled through his teeth. "Plans build stone. Stone lasts." Keb raised his spade into the air and shouted the phrase once more. "Rend, Hull!" Everyone else did the same, with whatever they were carrying themselves. Rice's hands began to shake, now that the immediate danger had pulled away. She looked down and saw mud on her knuckles and blood on the hook's edge. Pell limped up to her, holding his side, and tried to grin. "You see his face when he went under," he said breathlessly. "I saw you hesitate," Rice said. Pell's grin faltered, and he looked away. "I didn't want to." "I know." They both looked toward Keb, who stood alone, staring down at the black water that had surged up. The surface was calm now, but Ricer knew how deep it went. Sarah approached him, her steps careful. "You saved us," she said. Keb shook his head. "The fens saved you. I just called them for help." Sarah touched her cheek where she had been struck. "Why did you shout that?" Keb's eyes stayed on the water. "No special reason. It just came out." "It sounded special," Pell said, and there was a curious note in his voice. Keb finally looked up, and his eyes moved over them, taking in faces and injuries. "It's what my father used to say when a boat got stuck," he said, "when a net snarled, when the reeds didn't want to come up. It's old talk. It isn't even our tongue anymore. But it means the same thing it always meant." "And what's that?" Risa asked. Keb smiled. "It means stop asking politely."
Not every obstacle exists to be overcome, and not every place is waiting to be improved. Some ground holds because it refuses, and some words mark the moment a person decides not to give way. Those are the words that outlive all of us.